Hey guys, it's me again. Here we are in our second chapter, our second body system chapter, and this is all about, as you can see, blood. Okay, so want to usually start with a slide that kind of like sums up the chapter and what you're going to be seeing, physically seeing. What you can see up here on the screen is a field of blood cells, right? Just want to make sure you understand, and we're going to highlight some stuff here. I'm hoping that we'll be able to get into lab to actually look at these things in person in prepared slides, but we'll see what happens with everything going on. So um, there's a whole bunch of little details on this slide that I want to make sure that you're aware of. So these here, this is a purple cell, so is this one. These are white blood cells. Now the reason that you don't see them as white, of course, is because they've been stained so that you can see the nuclear material and you can see it's kind of bend around, and this one has a little bit of a different sort of arrangement to it. This is very diagnostic of the 5 different types of white blood cells that we'll be talking about in further down in the lecture. All of these little nondescript looking ones are red blood cells, so you can see just how many of them are in proportion to the white. You can also see platelet material, so that's these little tiny specks. There's one here, there's a couple other ones on the screen. And all that space in between all the cells also counts because that's a functional part of the blood. So all of this space, if you took ANP1, you would know that was matrix, right? That's the basically the non-living surroundings of blood cells that make up the tissue. But we are going to call this plasma. Okay, so plasma has a whole ton of useful things, metabolites, and other components to it that are going to make blood functional. So I think that that's an important to consider. A lot of people don't see the blank space is actually functional. So the components of blood, I mean, obviously every little part has its own job. So as you can see here, the functions of blood are to distribute materials to the tissues in the body. That is the primary function of blood. Every cell in your body is kind of trapped. There's really no cells other than sperm cells, but there's really no cells that can, move, and go get what they need, like oxygen and sugar and, things like that. So because your blood is really the only mobile tissue that can go from one part of your body to another, its job is to spread nutrients, right? So nutrients like everything that you eat, oxygen, that kind of thing, right? And electrolytes, which are also a part of what you eat. And if you're not familiar with what electrolytes are, I know we've mentioned this before. They would be charged atoms. So that'd be like sodium, potassium, calcium, those kinds of things. Okay. Your blood is also really important to regulate the body in terms of temperature, right? Which we'll talk about a little bit more, but if you get very, very hot, generally your skin reddens a little bit, right? And that's because the blood vessels expand on the surface, releasing heat. When you're very, very cold, the blood vessels constrict, and that basically holds heat internal, keeps the warm blood further internal into your body, right? So towards the core, in other words, and that maintains your body temperature and keeps it a little bit warmer. Fluid or water balance, this is important not so much, whole body, but for individual tissues. And I'll show you I'll say kind of a disturbing slide actually, that shows what happens when this fluid and water balance goes off in tissues. I also want to make sure that everybody understands that your blood is really the second line of defense for keeping germs out and making sure that they don't colonize the body. So immunity, really important. Not only is there cellular immunity, and that would be the white blood cells we saw before, so you can say WBCs, but that's also antibodies are circulating through the blood, which are produced by white blood cells and other tissues. So we will be talking about that a lot when we do the immunology chapter. And obviously, if you cut yourself, you really don't want to lose too much blood since it is so important, as you can see up above, right? So clotting is a really important aspect of blood that keeps all of that tissue in the system so that you can keep doing everything that you can see there above. Okay, so let's start to break this down proportionally into what blood is made of. Okay, so first of all, the liquid component of blood is slightly more than half the volume. It's about 55% in a well-hydrated person anyway. And in that plasma, right, that liquid that all the cells are kind of like floating around in, and distributed in, that would be mostly water, of course, sugar, salts, hormones, proteins and amino acids, other things. The formed elements, which we're basically calling cells, although one's kind of a cell, would be leukocytes. Leukocytes make up the vast minority of blood cells. They're only 1% of the blood volume, um, but they're an effective 1%. Now, this can change if an infection comes around. You will make more white blood cells in response to an infection, which you could kind of predict, right? If I'm sick and white blood cells are the ones that are going to remove the germs, it kind of makes sense that my body would make more of them, right? Erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, are these little, sort of like, punch down dough looking things up here. Not quite a donut, the hole's not all the way through, right? um, make up about 44% of blood volume. So what does that tell you? The immune response that leukocytes carry out is, sufficient at 1% of the blood volume. Red blood cells are 44% of the blood volume because their sole purpose in, existence is to carry oxygen, right? So we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Now, the one cell type that I had mentioned before that it's kind of a cell, really. That's why they call it formed elements. It's not a true cell. Would be platelets, those little tiny chunks of cellular material that I pointed out on the first slide. Thrombocytes, although not true cells, are really indispensable in helping to form clots when there is a breach, in a blood vessel and blood starts leaking out of you. Thrombocytes are really important in making sure that that doesn't happen for too long and therefore you bleed out. Okay, so just talking about plasma, which has gotten a lot of attention, especially with coronavirus and stuff. Plasma is all the dissolved components of your blood. In other words, smaller than actual cells, right? Will be dissolved or distributed through the plasma. Now, 90% of this 55% here is water, right? So do the math there. Um, but the rest of it is solutes, right? In which we had kind of mentioned before. So there's a bunch of different proteins. Um, there are enzymes, there are antibodies, which are going to be really important in immunity, as I said before, but we're going to hold off and talk about it when we get to that chapter. We'll talk about it in terms of blood typing in this chapter, but how it goes against germs is something a little bit more detailed. Uh, Fibrinogen, which is a protein that will form clots along with thrombocytes, um, or we can call them platelets, when a breach actually occurs in a blood vessel. Okay, so the proper chemical balance of plasma is essential for tissue function. Examples, now we'll talk about this in class, but if you're one of those people that like to watch these videos ahead of time so that you can contribute to class, please do, right? I'm basically giving you guys free brownie points here, right? Examples would be dehydration, right? If that water balance, shifts downwards, right? And, you go to 80% or so of the total volume of plasma, obviously that can be a problem, right? If dehydration happens, not only does the solvent decrease in proportion, but, think about it, it would only make mathematical sense that the solutes increase in proportion, right? So really what we're saying is that the plasma becomes more concentrated with all the solutes that you can see up above. That's not necessarily a good thing. It can put cells in kind of a sticky situation, which we call a hypertonic environment. That's not good, right? So what if you don't have proper chemical balance where you have potassium thrown off of sodium? That can also cause physiological problems. So because this liquid is surrounding all the cells and basically bringing the cells what they need, it's important that um, that proportion stays relatively stable and in homeostasis. What's going to regulate that? That's like the last chapter, right? So that's hormones a lot of times. Okay, so the metabolites in plasma, in other words, metabolites, if you're unfamiliar with this term, metabolites are basically, the end product of chemical reactions in cells, right? So in other words, cells are, converting sugar and oxygen to ATP. They're forming proteins through the central dogma of biology, from their DNA. Well, that leads, and there's a million other things that cells do. So that leads to waste products sometimes, right? Waste products are excreted out of the cell because they're waste products, and it's the blood's job to actually flush them away from the cells and get them out of the body, right? So cellular metabolites, especially nitrogen-containing compounds, and this would be from protein synthesis, right? Because proteins have a lot of nitrogen in them. Would be like urea, uric acid, creatine, and ammonia. So these are all relatively, well, in high amounts, they can be pretty toxic compounds that your blood is literally taking away from your cells and getting rid of it. Now, where is it going to go? Okay, obviously it has to go somewhere. Your kidneys are really good at filtering out nitrogenous wastes like this. So we'll be talking about that when we do the urinary system. The electrolytes that are in the blood, the positive ones, which you know are cations, and you can read them for yourself, right? The anions, chlorine, and then you can have phosphates, sulfates, and carbonates. These are all, important as far as maintaining blood pH and also providing an electrochemical gradient. Now, we're probably not going to talk about that too much, but keep in mind your nerves and muscles work with voltage, right? They're literally using electric charges to do their thing, right? Well, if you can set up, a difference between these charged ions, especially the cations, across the cell membrane, that can lead to muscle contraction or nerve conduction. If you want to know more about that, that's a little bit outside of the scope of what I'm going to talk about here. But if you want to know more about that, this is a very A&P1 thing. We can always zoom together, and I can fill you in about that how that whole thing works. Respiratory gases, of course, are also dissolved in the blood. Your blood takes these gases to the cells that need them. Think about that, that one cell in your big toe or something like that. You want to keep it alive, of course, right? So it can't go get these gases. It's got to get them from the blood, right? So where your blood is going to exchange CO2 for oxygen is, of course, in the lungs. And we have a whole unit on the respiratory system. We're just getting started in this semester. But oxygen has to be delivered to cells. CO2 has to be taken away from cells because it is a waste product. Okay, so one last slide before I think we end this, first video here. So formed elements. Erythrocytes, or what we call red blood cells, are biconcave, right? So in other words, they're pinched in on both sides, right? So kind of like, flat circles that are pinched in the middle, right? Um, what does that mean? That means that that little depression in the middle is actually good for surface area. Okay, so the surface area of these cells is slightly increased so that they can absorb oxygen a little bit faster if they're biconcave. Okay, unlike a lot of other cells in your body, they also do not have a nucleus. So, you probably were taught, as I was in biology, that all cells have a nucleus. It's that little round thing that's in the middle of the cell. Cells don't have a nucleus because their sole job, all red blood cells' existence, is to carry oxygen. That's all they do. They don't have to move. They don't really have to make new proteins. They don't really have to regulate, the expression of any genes other than hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is what holds on to oxygen. Okay, so this has a very high affinity for oxygen. So when those white or red blood cells rather go to your lungs, the hemoglobin absorbs the oxygen, and with no nucleus on the inside, they just have that much more room to carry oxygen. They also don't use oxygen for respiration. Cells have to, process energy to stay alive, just like any other living thing. They use lactic acid fermentation instead. So, in other words, they don't use oxygen. Now, this is really adaptive because, I mean, as I just said before, red blood cells are supposed to be delivering oxygen to other body tissues. It would be kind of, inefficient if if the red blood cell were to use up the oxygen that it was supposed to be delivering. It's like asking me, hey, can you go get me a coffee at Wawa? And I say, sure. I go to Wawa, I drink half the coffee, and then I give it to you when I come back. I mean, that's not really, the most efficient way to, get somebody a coffee, right? So why are all these things adaptive? Every one of these, things, all four of these characteristics, allow red blood cells to carry more oxygen and to deliver it to cells more efficiently, right? So, think about it. Even the evolution of our, red blood cells has been optimized over time, which I think is a pretty interesting story. So, going to end this video here, and we'll go on to the next part.